It's now 100 years since societies began banning the ownership and use of drugs. So how's that been working out? Johann Hari is the author of Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. Johann, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Sean. I'm feeling slightly nauseated by your onion story.
Yes, sorry.
I'm glad to be with you otherwise.
In your book, in terms of, I suppose, in the way that recreational drug use has been showcased in the public mind, you kind of, as exemplars, you use three people in your book who've made us think the way we think about drug and drug use. Who are those three people?
There's more than three people in the book, but I would say one that I start with is Billie Holiday. You know, in 1939, Billie Holiday, the famous jazz singer, stands on stage in New York City and she sings Strange Fruit, obviously a song about lynching, a song against lynching. That was regarded as really shocking to have a black woman singing against lynching in front of a white audience. And that night, she got a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. They said, according to her biographer, Julia Blackburn, stop singing this song. Billie Holiday refused, and that's when her stalking as an addict began. And the guy who launched the war on drugs, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a man called Harry Anslinger, played a crucial role in killing her, as the book reveals. The reason why I open with that, it might seem like an odd place to begin, is because actually, and I didn't understand this fully until I started doing the research for this book, although I had hints of it. When we think about why the war on drugs began, we think, oh, it must be for the reasons that we would give. It must be because people didn't want their kids to use drugs or they didn't want people to become addicted. Actually, that was barely part of the conversation. The reason why drugs were banned in the United States and then the US imposed it on the rest of the world was because they believed black people and Chinese people were using drugs, forgetting their place and imagining they were equal with white people. It was a proxy way of keeping black and Chinese people down. And the story of Billie Holiday and how they destroyed her and eventually played a role in killing her, to me is really important in terms of understanding why drugs were banned. It's not like someone sat there and made a rational assessment and said the world will be a better place if we criminalize these drugs and they're controlled by criminal gangs. It was a much more irrational hysteria that it began in, and it's maintained by an irrational hysteria now.
And I you know, if people might be aware of the reefer madness idea, and
exactly. Harry Anslinger is the man who launched the reefer madness idea. So basically, the guy who was involved in killing Billie Holiday, he takes over the Department of Prohibition in the United States just as alcohol prohibition is ending. So he's got this really big department with loads of people with nothing to do, and he has to find it a new purpose. So even though he had said and believed initially that cannabis was not that harmful, certainly less harmful than alcohol, he suddenly announces cannabis is worse than heroin. He announces that it will drive you insane. He latches on tiny numbers of cases of people who he believed had used cannabis, gone insane and killed people. Actually, it later emerged they hadn't even used cannabis, these people, or there was no evidence that cannabis played any role in their crimes. But he presented this idea that cannabis drives you insane, which was really the reason why cannabis was banned. And these are myths that persist to this day.
Because it also seemed to be vaguely connected to this idea that black men would smoke cannabis and have sex with white women.
He said that explicitly. His it's one of the reasons why he hated jazz. He saw it as like an expression of intermixing. And one of the things I wanted to do with Chasing the Scream was, I went on this big journey. We'd had addiction in my family, and I wanted to understand why for 100 years we'd waged war on drug use and drug addicts. And what I discovered that really kind of shocked me is almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs aren't what we think they are. Drug addiction isn't what we think it is. The drug war is not driven for the reasons that we're told. And drug legalization and the alternatives are not what we think they are. I went to so many different places, from the killing fields in Ciudad Juarez to, a prison in Arizona where women are forced to go out on chain gangs, wearing T-shirts saying I was an addict. They're forced to dig graves, to meeting the surviving friends of Billie Holiday, to actually the only country in the world that's decriminalized all drugs, Portugal, 15 years ago, with really extraordinary effects.
Is there any country in the world where prohibition has worked even partially? In the sense that they can say, well, we introduced prohibition at X date and now our drug problem, as it's perceived to be, has reduced.
Well, drug use goes up and down, not according to whether it's banned. We know that because Portugal decriminalised everything and drug use remains steady. It very slightly increased, but addiction actually fell significantly for reasons that I can explain. Basically, what they decided to do was to transfer all the money they used to spend on arresting drug users, putting them on trial, putting them in prison. They decided to spend all that money instead on really compassionate care for addicts and reconnecting them with society. So subsidised jobs, subsidised housing. And the results are now in. It's been 15 years, and injecting drug use has fallen by 50%. That's 50%. All studies show addiction is down significantly. I interviewed João Figueira, who was the leader of the opposition to decriminalisation. Kind of honest, prohibitionist, who, gave warnings that I think a lot of your listeners would completely understandably have about what would happen if we did this. And he said to me, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, everything I said would happen didn't happen. Everything the other side said would happen did happen. Not only is this a good thing, I hope the whole world does it. The thing that I think is really important to understand, I wanted to tell the story of the war on drugs through the stories of lots of individuals whose lives have been changed one way or another in the way that I saw in my own family, from, a transsexual crack dealer in Brooklyn to a scientist who was spends his life feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see what would happen. But I really wanted people at the end to understand, I went and looked at what the alternatives are to the way we've been doing it for 100 years. And what was really striking is the alternatives work incredibly well. Nowhere has experimented with moving beyond the drug war and regretted it.
Now, in the Portuguese model, it's not just about decriminalisation, as you imply. That a whole set of other services have to be in place.
You're totally right. Just removing the legal penalties and doing nothing else is not a good idea. The question is, we've got a certain amount of money to spend, right? With the certain amount of money you have to spend, for example, in Ireland, is the best thing to do to spend that money trying to physically keep these chemicals from entering your country, which is impossible. We can't even keep drugs out of prisons, and we control the walled perimeter, right? You can spend the money on that, which we know doesn't work, and no one can say we didn't give it a fair shot. It doesn't work. It's not possible. Or we can spend it on really honest drug education for teenagers, which is what they do in Portugal, which is why after the decriminalisation, teenage drug use actually fell a little bit. It then went back to the level it had been when they decriminalised. It hasn't gone up at all. And really honest and really good, compassionate care for addicts, treating them as human beings who deserve our love and support in the way we think of with alcoholics. No one thinks alcoholics are evil and depraved people who we need to punish. In fact, most people can see if you put someone in prison for being an alcoholic, they would actually get worse. They would be more disconnected. They would be more cut off. And there's loads of stories in the book of really amazing and inspiring people I met all over the world who I think really explain that story so well.
Are there people in the world who have, apart from people who sell drugs, are there other people who perhaps have a vested interest in maintaining the war on drugs?
Oh yeah, it's interesting you should say that about people who sell drugs. One of the things that most shocked me when I was doing this research is at the start of the war on drugs, when they were first banned, there was it was done state by state initially. There was a big loophole in the law that basically said we're banning it for recreational users for heroin and cocaine, but doctors can prescribe to whoever they want, right? So for a long time, doctors just prescribed to anyone because they would rather their patients got it from them than got it on the street from criminals who screwed up the drug. And it was shut down state by state. And what happened in California was really interesting. The Chinese criminals in California, Chinese drug gangs, were annoyed that in Nevada, that all the legal routes to drugs have been shut down, and the Nevada criminals got to sell it all. So they bribed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics agents to enforce the drug laws harder, to actually begin the drug war. Because right from the start, the people who benefited from the drug war far and away the most are armed criminal gangs. If you ban a popular substance, it doesn't vanish. It gets transferred to criminals. Those criminals are armed. They're dangerous. They fight and kill to protect their patch, and they destroy the drug, they contaminate the drug. Everything about that situation is a bad idea. You're totally right to ask, are there other people who win from it? And we can see that. For example, if you look at California had a referendum on whether to legalize marijuana, and one of the biggest backers of there were several big backers of the campaign to, there was the no campaign. One was the prison guards union, because there's a hell of a lot of people employed in prisons in America. The prison industry is massive. I don't remember if it was that specific marijuana campaign or another one, but I know that the alcohol lobby have been big funders as well of not legalizing marijuana, because one of the things we know is that when you legalise cannabis, a lot of people transfer from getting drunk on a Saturday night to getting stoned on a Saturday night. Now, some people in the drug reform movement think that's an improvement. I don't think it's an improvement. I think it's pretty much, I'm neutral between getting stoned and getting drunk. I don't do either. But I don't think one is better than the other. But I also don't think one is worse than the other. I don't think if you told me that tomorrow night you're going to get stoned in order to unwind, I would think you were a worse person than if you told me you were going to have a bottle of wine.
What's the situation vis-a-vis cannabis in Portugal? Is it still just decriminalised rather than legalised?
Absolutely everything is decriminalised. So the way it works is, say you now had some cannabis or indeed some crack. The police don't go looking for drug users, so they don't. Social workers go looking for drug users to see if they can help them if there's any problems. But the police don't go looking for it. If you got in a fight and they happen to find it on you, they would take it off you, and you would be referred to something called the Dissuasion Commission, which is really simple. You just go along. You have an appointment, you have to go within a week. You have an appointment, you have a chat with a social worker there. They basically have a conversation with you. If you seem to be an addict, they explain that they can get you, it wouldn't be so much the case with cannabis, but with other drugs, if they think you're an addict, they explain we can get you into rehab today, now. You can go this afternoon if you want to go. We will look after you, we will care for you. And if you're not an addict, they'll give you some advice on how to stay healthy and how to avoid addiction and avoid all other problems. Right, okay.
Because just staying with cannabis, I suppose a concern many people would have is that strains of cannabis are considerably stronger than they used to be, and there would be a worry about kids, teenagers whose brains aren't fully formed yet, overdoing it and actually seriously damaging themselves.
Oh, you're totally right. And there's two things about that's not only a legitimate concern, it's one of the main reasons why I'm in favour. My book is dedicated to my nephews who are teenagers who I really don't want to be smoking, certainly skunk or marijuana of any kind. There's two things to explain about that. One is, a funny thing happens when you ban a substance. Best way to explain it is when alcohol was banned in America, the most popular drink by far was beer. Within a few weeks, the most popular drink was whiskey and moonshine, right? You think, well, why would that be? Why would banning it change it? It's a very simple thing. People still wanted beer, they couldn't get it. Because you imagine if you and me had to smuggle enough to give enough drink to a pub for a Saturday night. If we smuggle beer, we can only get 100 people their drink. If we smuggle whiskey, we can get 1,000 people their drink, right? Whatever happens when you ban a substance, the most concentrated and extreme form of that substance becomes the only one you can get hold of. It's why when alcohol prohibition ended, beer straight away became the most popular drink again. Exactly the same thing has happened with cannabis. Most people who smoke cannabis do not want super skunk. In the same way that go to a pub, how many people are drinking vodka? How many people are drinking absinthe? Virtually none. The problem is with banning these things is only the most extreme form of the drug becomes available. This is true of cocaine. The most popular way of consuming cocaine prior to it being banned was in tea, coca tea. Very mild, not addictive, not very dangerous. It disappeared. When you have a further crackdown on cocaine in the 80s, what happens? You get crack, an even more intense form. This is called the iron law of prohibition, and it's a really important thing for people to understand. When you legalize, you will have people using a much milder form of the drug. The second point you make about kids, which is really important as well, I spoke to a guy called Fred Martins, who was an undercover cop in Wayne, New Jersey. And he had an epiphany. He was a really strong believer about the war on drugs, and he had an epiphany one day. He was scouting out, he was undercover, and he was scouting out a drug dealer. And a 13-year-old boy came up to him and said, hey, mister, I'm not allowed to buy alcohol. Will you go into that shop and buy some for me? And he said, get out of here. So the kid went up to the drug dealer and bought some marijuana instead, because drug dealers don't check ID, And this is a really important thing to understand. No one in my nephew's school is selling Jack Daniels. No one in my nephew's school is selling Budweiser. There's a lot of people selling weed and pills. If we want to protect our kids, one of the strongest reasons for ending prohibition is that we can protect our children. There are studies in the United States that show kids find it much easier to get hold of cannabis than alcohol.
Isn't that weird? Johann, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for speaking with us today. That's Johann Hari there, author of Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs.